uh, will hurt the dignity of these people through these policies. With this march of the people, which proves how elevated is the honor of our homeland. From this summoned this march, people said this would be a failure and called that this. They don't know the Cuban people. They underestimate our patriotism and our revolution. Other spokespeople of the U.S. government and the anti-Cuban mafia who encourage the idea of this march against the U.S. people. We have nothing against the U.S. people or hatred against them, against those humble, noble people of that country. And we want to strengthen cooperation between the two nations. We extend our support to all of the governments of the U.S. since the Trump of the revolution, always looking for a serious relationship and equality. But if the U.S. insists in its disposition to break our independence, our sovereignty, our socialism, they will only find rebellion and perseverance. To each administration which has tried, the Cuban Revolution has survived, and this will continue to be this way. This will be a very anti-imperialist march against the North American imperialism and its intention of impose in Cuba. We will march now and ever. We march now. We march now to say to the U.S. government, leave the Cuban people live in peace. Down with interference. Down with the blockade. Down with unilateral coercive measures against Cuba. Down with the permanence of Cuba in the list of countries to sponsor terrorism. Against genocide against the Cuban people. Socialism or death. Homeland or death, we will triumph. Greetings, viewers. The Cuban television is broadcasting the march of the Cuba people against the U.S. blockade and the inclusion of Cuba in the list of countries to sponsor terrorism. According to the Central Committee of the Republic of Cuba, President Miguel Diaz-Canel Bermudez, the images show the presence of the leader of the Cuban Revolution, Raul Castro-Ruz, before the people representing the whole country marching towards the Havana's Malecon. I will share this broadcasting with my colleagues Talia Gonzalez and Pep Medina. Good afternoon, Ferdinand Mejias and all of the viewers. These images are being broadcasted live from the Cuban television to the world. Reaffirmation of the revolution of Havana. In representing whole Cuba, an anti-imperialist march, as he has said, is not against the U.S. people. It's a march against the blockade. and interference and the permanence of Cuba in that list that allegedly sponsored terrorism. And today we have several representatives of the universities in the capital there. Good afternoon, Froilan, Talia, viewers. This is the United March of the Cuban people and people from Havana representing the whole population of Cuba against blockade, against terrorism, and the unity. We all representing Cuba revolution, socialism, and this march will take place before the U.S. embassy in the U.S. in Cuba, and is condemning terrorism, which is something illegal, and it's condemning all of the terrorist practices in all of its manifestations against whoever wants and wherever is perpetrated terrorist actions, whatever they are, including those in which the government are involved directly. Ahead of the march, General Raul Castro Ruz, leader of the Cuban Revolution, joined by the first secretary of the Cuban Party, Miguel Diaz-Canel, president of Cuba, who spoke before. Equally, members of the Directive Board, Esteban Lazo Hernandez, president of the State Council, and also commander of the Rebel Army, Ramon Machado Ventura, Dr. Roberto Vera Ojeda, secretary of the Communist Party of Cuba, Prime Minister Manuel Marrero Cruz, along with the Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez Parrilla, Secretary General of the Central Workers of Cuba, Ulises de Nacimiento, and also student leaders, mass organizations present in this March of the People. A firm representation of people from Havana to demand the lifting of the blockade against our country and exclude our country from this list of countries that allegedly sponsor terrorism. It is also a march for unity, dignity, and honor. A demonstration in front of the embassy of the U.S. Embassy, showing that the support of the people for the revolution is the same, the unity, cohesion. The Cuban flag makes greater this march of the people. Also, we talk about the leaders of this march, and we see them there in the images broadcasted by the Cuban television. People from the health sector, also students from medical schools in our capital, and workers from BioCuba Pharma Company, and a block of workers from the Union of Science, Education, and Sport sectors that constitute conquerors of the Cuban Revolution. The President of the Republic was saying in his speech from the anti-imperialist tribune, saying that this is a symbolic image of our national hero, Jose Marti, that the blockade is a genocidal policy that must stop since it represents obstacle for exports and deprives the Cuban people from medicines in the midst of a pandemic. It's a criminal act, and here's the people to denounce this and other atrocities. A criminal and genocidal act by the U.S. government. Here we are. We have been able to survive this pandemic, all of the Cubans marching here, and those watching this inside and out of Cuba. And it was possible thanks to the intelligence and talent, and also because of the desire of continue with the revolution, the homeland, or scientifics that we achieved for Cuban vaccines, thanks to our scientists the same scientists that are here in this march. Here we see Biocuba Pharma, a Cuban company, and are the people that have gone through blackouts and power supply cuts, two hurricanes and earthquakes, and here is the Cuban people defending its revolution, the conquers, and the legacy of those young people of the centenario generation, honoring the memory and the legacy of these. The step of the people from the capital that are marching in front of the embassy of the U.S., we see the energy and heroism that our commander-in-chief always taught us, who in so many opportunities we walk that same path. And the president recalled, and we do so in several media, that 20 years ago, on May 13, 2004, in the sculpture Martí Acusador, there in the anti-imperialist tribuna, commander-in-chief, historic leader of our revolution, headed a gigantic march rejecting the fascist measures that wanted to increase the blockade, and showed our disposition to defend our homeland. In that occasion, Commander-in-Chief ended his speech with a phrase we all remember, who we were able to watch it. He said, "Since you, addressing the President of the U.S., has decided that the cards are on the table, we have the pleasure to say goodbye as Roman gladiators. Save Caesar, those who are going to die greet you. I only regret that I cannot even see your face, because you will be 1,000 kilometers of distance and I would be on the first line to die fighting, defending our homeland." One of the greatest privileges Cuban people have had, that today live with the revolution, and we were there and listened to our commander-in-chief marching, heading this march. And by the way, next December 20, January 10, the current administration is left 30 days to end its position in office. And Biden, in these 4 years of administration, has kept remaining all of the coercive measures imposed by Donald Trump. So this administration has exactly 30 days. They can do something if they want to, if they will, to take us out of that illegitimate list of countries that supposedly sponsor terrorism. This march proves the honor of the Cuban people and the history of our fight, said the president. The president said if the U.S. insists, they only will find rebellion and persevering of the Cuban people. This march is against the U.S. interference, down with the genocide, and he was talking about important information of the damage caused by blockade, which affect the Cuban people in figures of $421 million monthly, an alarming figure, said our president. The system of measures which are coercive, and it's the longest ever applied against any nation. It's a march against the U.S. blockade that harming economically our country. And the president and first secretary of the Cuban Party said that it is not a march against the North American people. It's a march anti-imperialist. And recently, several reports have been published in which an initiative boosted by several organizations within the U.S. have been promoted, calling to exclude our country from the list of countries that allegedly sponsor terrorism. The Legislative Committee of Cuba C Organization, National Network of Cuba, and Cuba's Solidarity. These are organizations that have encouraged President Biden to take measures to end with this inclusion of Cuba in this list. These organizations have published that unions invite people to take part in this letter of the Cuban president to encourage the U.S. president to take Cuba out of this list of countries. He can do it. We're talking about the impact of the blockade, of the U.S. blockade against our economy, and the impact it has on the social life of Cuban people, but also in this march to take Cuba out of this list of countries sponsors of terrorism. We cannot forget it. Cuba has been victim of terrorist acts that took life of 2,478 Cubans and injured 2,099. Our country has fought terrorism and has never participated in financing, sponsoring terrorist acts against any country, and our territory has never been used to these purposes. Cuba has never supported terrorist acts internationally, and in a unilateral way, an arbitrary way, Cuba was included in the list of the Department of State of the U.S. of countries that don't collaborate in the fight against terrorism, that was published in 2020, and it is well known, is something without reason that only serves as coercion against countries that refuse to accomplish the will of the U.S. government and to interfere in our decision. A lot of happiness we see in the faces of the people we see in the Cuban television. This is a country that has a lot to celebrate, conquers the freedom, the independence of which we enjoy, and also we're there in this anti-imperialist tribune that has seen so much history, and now this beautiful, colorful march with the Cuban flag and the mixture of students, workers. There we have General Raul Castro Ruz heading his people, the daily fights of the Cuban people. In spite of the difficult economic conditions our country is going through, representing different sectors, the education minister, with teachers, professors, students, in this incredible fight to prosper despite the difficulties that the country is facing. You were talking about Raul, and it's so good seeing these young people of the generation of centenary eternal rebeldes, along with the generation of an organization, FEM, our students, workers, farmers, that are also marching for Cuba, for the revolution, and proving the world unity and defense of our revolutionary conquerors and our revolution, in spite of all of the lies and fake news that are published in social media or even international media against our country. These are the images right now from the Havana Malecon, and that demonstrate the support of the people against blockade and the inclusion of Cuba of the list of countries sponsors of terrorism, so that the government take us out of that list. And we see also the images headed the leader of the Cuban Revolution, Raul Castro, heading the march, along with another authorities of the Cuban state and different generations united who are part of the history and present of our revolution, heading this patriotic anti-imperialist march for dignity and honor. As so many times, once again, all Cubans are united to prove in front of the U.S. embassies that our unity and our strength and our decision will of remaining firm will be the most powerful weapon against the attempts of our enemies to hurt our sovereignty and our independence. Again, we see the images of Raul and other leaders of the revolution heading the march. We will march to celebrate free and sovereign the 66th anniversary of the triumph of the Cuban Revolution. If we went through so many difficulties without giving up, it's because we're better than our enemies. And when I say enemy, I don't speak only about the empire that harass us, but some things that can hurt us inside. Was saying the president a few hours ago in the closing session of the National Assembly of the Popular Power. With our previous history and the people we want, the only alternative is to fight ever honor to victory. And in this march of the people representing the whole country from the capital, we have also workers from civil defense, people from the Cuban Armed Forces, Ministry of Interior, the Cuban Communist Young People Union. This year have took place beside this march with a broad participation of the people from the capital on October 28th, commemorating Camilo Cienfuegos, and on November 27, remembering the 8 medicine students who were killed. And here is this march of the Cuban people in front of the U.S. Embassy in Havana. I hope nobody tries to say that these people are forced to be here in this march, which was summoned recently by the president of the Cuban people of Cuba. Because along with the people, we have our deputies to the National Assembly, which ended the 10th session on the Palace of Conventions of the capital. This is the Cuban people. We have the people of Havana representing the Cuban people. Cuba is the famous enemy that doesn't exist for the government of the U.S. Cuba has never been an enemy of the U.S. people. U.S. has been our enemy. They wanted to be our enemy. That blockade and the work to overthrow our revolution from international media has been a failure, and we are here and we remain. We were talking about how much this blockade damages our commerce and our population, as our television is broadcasting live this March in front of the embassy of the U.S. in Havana, condemning the genocidal blockade imposed by Washington and demanding the exclusion of Cuba of the list of countries sponsors of terrorism. The decision of including Cuba in the illegitimate list of countries that supposedly sponsor terrorism adds new restriction on the daily life of all of us, the development of our economy. is a cynical measure since Cuba has not sponsored terrorism but has been a victim of the terrorist action from the U.S. territory, was reminded by President Diaz-Canel when he referred to confessed terrorists as Luis Posada Carriles, who lived in plenty until they passed in Miami. These actions, financed and organized from U.S. territory, counted with the support of U.S. authorities, reminding that Cuba holds a strong position to be an intermediary in peace conversations between the Colombian government, the Colombian armed forces, with the same spirit as a decade ago. Two member states of CELAC declared Latin America and the Caribbean so, territory of peace based on the principles of international law. There's a record of hostilities and terrorist acts against officials designed in the being in Washington representing Cuba in New York. We must recall that Felix Garcia Rodriguez, diplomat, was murdered in New York, and direct attacks were carried out against the embassy of Cuba and the headquarters of Cuba in that city. So bad the U.S. government didn't condemn, but didn't reject either the attack that was carried out against the embassy of Cuba in that country in April 2020 that endangered lives and security of the diplomats in our embassy. An arbitrary and unilateral measure was this measure of including Cuba in this list of countries that don't fight terrorism. Cuba is victim of terrorist activities sponsored from U.S. territory with the support of authorities of that country, but Cuba has a clear and strong position of facing terrorism in all of its forms, all of its manifestations. It is a cruel act since it is designed to increase the suffering of the Cuban people, as we took just instances ago. Just Joe Biden can end with this lie and finish these measures that several governments and prime ministers, parliamentaries, and other leaders, also thousands of organizations of the world, and the U.S. itself. Here is the proof on December 20th of the Cuban people against the genocide, that is blockade, and the inclusion of Cuba in the list of countries that allegedly sponsor terrorism. In the 30 days Biden has left in office, Biden could take Cuba out of this list, and if he has some decency, he wants to keep a legacy, as he proposed in his previous political campaign. He said he was going to modify Trump's policies towards our country. He could change this. Meanwhile, Cubans will continue to fight against aggression, against blockade, against manipulation, against lie. And if we need a proof, again, the march of the people from Havana in this march against blockade and the permanence of Cuba in the list of countries that allegedly sponsor terrorism is a demonstration of the response of our people: dignity, honor, strength, and unity. in the face of lies and genocide of the policies of the US. These have been 4 years very difficult. Biden could sign and take Cuba out of the list of countries that sponsor terrorism, but there will be other person in the White House, someone who has actually demonstrated hatred toward our country. We need to wait for what the next president of the US is going to say. Our president said it in the National Assembly. We are ready to continue resisting and to keep fighting against terrorist actions of the US government against Cuba. The genocide of that blockade that doesn't allow the development. The blockade is real, it exists, it hurts, and it deprives our little island from development. And the only mistake we have made, the only thing wrong we have done for the US government is defending our sovereignty, our revolution, a legacy of those young people of the centenary generation with the triumph of the revolution on January 1st, 1959, and develop ourselves with our own efforts. That is the only wrong thing we have done. They don't want a revolution to exist and keep existing for over 60 years in their own faces, the Cuban Revolution. The first secretary of the Central Committee of the party highlighted before the start of this march, that was headed by the Army General Raul Castro Ruz, leader of the Cuban Revolution, along with the authorities of our country and the government and state. President Diaz-Canel reiterated that Cuba is willing to dialogue with the U.S. people to hold, maintain relations, bilateral relations based on independence and the sovereignty of our country, and also is opened. He was highlighting it in the closing session of the 19th session of the. And he also emphasized that will be rejected strongly any attempt of interference, and the answer, said the president, is not to give concessions to those who intend to destroy us or take us out of the socialist path. We will get out of the difficulties based on our talent, innovation, work, and creative resistance. This is the march of truth against the unfair sanctions committed against our U.S. government, against our country, which has been increased and strengthened this blockade. The Cuban flag is writings from the Havana Malecon, this gigantic march of the people of the capital. The heart of Cuba is here in the Havana Malecon, and the president said we will not march against the U.S. people that has shown love and solidarity. We will march to stop blockade and take our country out of the list of countries that allegedly sponsor terrorism. We march with the legacy of Fidel Castro, that there's no strength in the world to destroy true and ideas. And also the Army General celebrating the 65th anniversary of the revolution called for keeping unity, which is our main weapon, and has allowed this strategic island to survive, and the conquerors of our homeland, following the principles of Jose Marti, saying the homeland is humanity. Let's take care of our homeland, as our child said, the general, regarding the independence and sovereignty of our country. And this Friday, he has headed this march of the Cuban people, representing the whole country. And he was there proving that we can face difficulties together, as when he gathered with Fidel in Cinco Palmas, and with a few rifles and history that has been remembered, he said, right now we're going to win the war. We have growth with all these years of revolution, thanks to unity. Cuba is alive and persists in defending the history of this Cuban revolution, of the unforgettable Camilo Cienfuegos. And of course, Cuba, throughout all these years, has done everything to keep defending its ideologies, its revolutionary process. And every time you listen and read about someone who doesn't know Cuban reality saying Cuba is a terrorist country, that's one of the strategies used by Bush and Obama and Trump's administrations to say that Cuba is an enemy of the U.S., which is not true. And Obama tried to change this policy. The biggest aggression was in Bush era, which was a priority of his administration. And during Donald Trump's administration, it again happened. And the coincidence between Obama and Trump is that Obama said Cuba is not terrorist, but the second one said that Cuba it is. And the inclusion of Cuba and the list of countries sponsors of terrorism has a political character. Bush did it because it was convenient for his policy. Obama got it out because it was good for his policy. But in any place, it is mentioned the participation of our citizens in terrorist acts against any country of the world. The inclusion of our country in this list not only obstaculizes economic transactions, it creates obstacles in export, financial restrictions, and avoids the entrance of humanitarian aid, and sanctions citizens just for traveling to our country, including Cuban citizens. Also interferes in bank transactions, and also prevents the use of online services, and prevents the realization of cultural and sports exchange. So it has an impact on the life of our country. So we see the images of the people of the capital taking part in this march against blockade, which is a genocidal blockade against our country, and the inclusion of Cuba in the list of countries sponsors of terrorism. And several of the actions that the U.S. administrations took were, for example, last year, the Department of State take Cuba out since it was showing the opportunist character of the U.S. administration. The Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, not only took the position of the Colombian government, but he highlighted the cooperation of Cuba, and these are enough arguments to justify this march of the Cuban people right now in the Cuban Malecon in Havana as a consequence of the harms they cause in economy and finance in our nation due to the inclusion of Cuba in this list. The Cuban flag continues here, heading somehow in the images we see in the Cuban television. This beautiful, this happy march, revolutionary march, and an anti-imperialist march, and of the people, with this worker people, because here we have initiative brought by the trade unions with their signs, the images of Raul, Fidel, their ideas that are present in this mobilization that has the intensity required for the current times. That yes for Cuba, that yes for the revolution, that yes for unity, which is what we defend today in the 66th anniversary of the triumph of the revolution. There we have the workers of the Electric Union, heroes in the recent days, carrying out hard work on the part of the workers of the Ministry of Energy and Mines. Also, we have our professors, professionals of all sectors, workers of the cultural sector that have demonstrated that Cuba has a beautiful culture. Culture has not lacked in the eastern of Cuba after the passage of a hurricane and earthquake. Since this march was summoned with scarce resources, since the mobilization has to do with the conditions, the situation the country is going through. We have students from the military schools, from the universities of medical sciences, the University of Havana, students from the organization FAM, and students organization and the Union of Communist Young People in this fighting this battle. Giant flags will go in front of the U.S. Embassy. The message of the people from the capital representing the whole country. We see the images of the workers of the Ministry of Energy and Mines that we were talking about minutes ago, and the important role they have played, especially the workers of the Electric Union. We were saying that it is the answer of the people from the capital representing the whole country, and then the decision of the Cuban people to remain firm with the revolution, independence, and sovereignty. Biden is left 30 days to end his administration. If he wanted, he could take some measures and sign an executive order to take our country out of the list of nations that sponsor terrorism. And during his 4 years of administration, Biden has kept the coercive measures that are cruel and were imposed by the government of Donald Trump, and he has even applied new ones, as the recent legislation that legalizes the thief of the Havana Club brand. It's a demonstration of the policy that was applied by Trump and also Biden applied. And its essence is reinforce the blockade, which has had catastrophic effects in our population regarding medicine, housing, and social sectors, and many sectors of our society. It has been a genocidal policy, and there is no country in the world that over 60 years has resisted these laws and measures that are part of the economic, trade, and financial blockade against our small country, our small archipelago. We are even neighbors, share same geographic area, and also cultural links, relative link, and we only ask for respect, respectful dialogue, and respect for our independence and sovereignty. As our president, Miguel Diaz-Canel Bermudez, said in his speech, but in the face of threats and the policy of hostility and the reinforce of blockade and other threats that could carry out the new administration, this will be the answer of the Cuban people: unity, strength towards the revolution and the party. Cuba's people had paid a high cost for over 60 years, and we're talking about respectful dialogue, but respectful dialogue and among equals, not a forceful dialogue or I have the power and you have to obey what I say. That is why the different governments of the U.S. are bothered about Cuba, because our country imposed a revolutionary conviction of what we want to do and how we want to build our country, how we want to develop our country. And from that, a lot of information and policies have been applied against Cuba. Different speeches and have been, for example, the negative comparison of Cuba and referring to Cuba and its links as the U.S. is the good one and this story. And these comparisons and stereotypes are linked to terrorism and the use of Islamic terrorism. And the link of Cuba, they want to show with that kind of terrorism as those related to the political regime of the country. And also in this speech, they make use of emotions and selected sources providing general information and ambiguity against a Cuba that doesn't exist. But this is the real Cuba, the true Cuba, that today is marching in front of the U.S. Embassy in this Malecon of Havana, showing our flag that it's being carried by humbled Cubans, people who make of Cuba a country that with dignity, honored ever to victory, has reads a sign carried by one of the Cubans of this march, along with the Cuban flag, representing several sectors of society. We saw also members of the armed forces and the Ministry of Interior as part of these people defending sovereignty and independence. Representative of the Ministry of Communication, of Culture, ICAIC, the Institute of Social Communication, representative of the NIAC and all of the sectors, people united against this genocidal blockade, this policy that is absurd for Cuba due to its impact on the markets, subjecting the society to constant pressure. And regarding the problems that Cubans have every day in this economic battle, economic war, that somehow show the pressures applied in Cuba and are part of the original design of the hostilities of the U.S. government and their purpose of subject the Cuban people and cause hunger and disease. Members of the U.S. society have showed disposition to cooperate with the Cuba government. U.S. representative has defended Cuba as said that it is not a terrorist country. Barbara Lee, in the session of the Chamber of Representatives, and she quoted that there is no evidence to assert this. She even said that specialized agencies of the U.S. give a value to Cuban cooperation and its fight against terrorism. Also, we have scientific development that could benefit the U.S. people, a bilateral relation, and the exclusion of Cuba from this list. For example, erythropoiesis, which is treatment to prevent amputation for diabetes, and it's used in the whole world for thousands of people, and however, it cannot be used in the U.S. This one and other discoveries of the Cuban science due to the inclusion of Cuba in this list that has this impressive popular answer in front of the U.S. Embassy, the march of the people, Cuban people from the capital, demanding the end of the blockade and the exclusion of Cuba of the list of countries sponsors of terrorism. This is a necessary march in difficult moments that our country is going through due to the policies of the U.S. government against Cuba that we cannot forget. The reality is that U.S. has caused damage with its foreign policy to our country. A necessary march showing that the people, as our president Miguel Diaz-Canel said in the closing session of the National Assembly, we are facing an international political situation that is complex, in which we have to be alert, and also we need to be sure that our strength is in the unity of the people, the unity that is shown right now in the Malecon of Havana in this march summoned by our president.
Debemos lograr que el país se vea como un país joven. No puede envejecer el espíritu de Cuba, que el país siempre sea joven, que los sucesos de este país tengan que identificarse con los jóvenes. ¡Tumba el bloqueo ya! Los cubanos estamos de pie y combatiendo con la fuerza de la unidad, con la fuerza de la verdad y de las ideas. No somos terroristas, quítenos de la lista. El general de ejército nos ha dicho, la historia nos ha enseñado con creces a dónde conducen la resignación y el derrotismo. No nos limitemos a resistir. Vamos a salir de estas dificultades como lo hemos hecho siempre, combatiendo. ¡Vivan Fidel y Raúl! ¡Viva la Revolución Cubana! ¡Abajo el bloqueo!
Nuestro comandante en jefe Fidel Castro Our commander-in-chief Fidel Castro expressed that we will defeat with loyalty against with the united people against the blockade, down the blockade. Long live the victorious people of Cuba. We have to topple the blockade already. The Cubans are in war footing, struggling against the blockade with the force of our ideas, and we're not terrorists. Let's take us out of the list. Army General has told us, the history has taught us where this resignation and terrorism leads us. We are not giving in. We're going to go out of these difficulties as always, combating, fighting. Long live Fidel and Raul. Long live the revolution, the Cuban Revolution. Down the blockade. If ever our flag is destroyed, our dead will rise to defend our people, to defend our homeland, down with the blockade. Our President Miguel Diaz-Canel has said, we will go out of these difficulties with creativity, potentially, and strengthening our plans, our innovation, our work, and the resistance, creative resistance of our people. The situation is very complex, but it's not unsurmountable. Down with the blockade. Long live the heroic people of Cuba. Fatherland of death, we will win. Let's topple the blockade already. The Cubans are now in war footing, struggling with the unity force, with the force of truth and the ideas. We are not terrorists. Let's get us out of the list. Down with imperialism. Long live our homeland. Down with the blockade. Down with the blockade. Let's topple the blockade. The Cubans are in war footing, struggling and fighting with our force, with the unity, with the force of the truth and ideas. We're not terrorists. Take us out of the list. Long live the Communist Party of Cuba. Long live the heroic people of Cuba. Let's topple with the blockade. The Cubans are now on war footing, struggling and fighting. Let's move forward. Our armed forces, revolutionary armed forces, to move forward. If our flag ever is destroyed, our dead will rise, and raising their arms will defend it in that position. Long live the revolution, the Cuban Revolution. Down with the blockade. Nobody here is scared. Down with the blockade. Long live the heroic Cuban people. With our force of unity, with the force of truth and ideas, we're not terrorists. Take us out of the list. We're not limiting ourselves to resist. We're going out of this situation like we have done it before, fighting. Long live Fidel and Raul. Long live the Cuban Revolution. Down with the blockade. As we have seen with these images, with the original audio from this place, next to the Embassy of the United States, the Imperialist Tribunal, and the access to this Malecon Seafront Drive, where this march is taking place with the presence, as you will see, of many youth of the University of the Science of Informatics, the University of Havana, the University Jose Marti, young people, students that are participating of this event. It is heroic event in which they're demanding the end of the blockade, of the U.S. blockade against our country, and not being included in the list that allegedly sponsored terrorism. These young people are protagonists of this patriotic march for the sovereignty of our country, and together with their father and grandfathers, like a generation, which means that unity continues to be our weapon, our indestructible weapon against the politic of high pressure against our country, which has been a political peace. Is actually part of a memorandum of a Marjorie more than 60 years ago, which he defined that the only way, and they knew that from that moment, that the only way to face the revolution, Cuban revolution, was to create unsatisfaction in the Cuban people and create economic problems and material problems. So now, he said that we have to employ and resort to any means to weaken the revolution in that way, to prevent Cuba from getting funds and to provoke hunger and desperation. And that is been written in the history and written very clearly in the United States politics, which was expressed in the highest degree during the 4 years of Donald Trump and during the 4 years of this present administration of Joe Biden, which has in his hands in this month the possibility to get our country from that list, and also to take executive measures to weaken the blockade against Cuba. We're talking about Mallory, which has been talked about, and we know very well. Martí said that a plan of enemy, we have to respond with another plan, a plan against plan. For Cuba, there's no other alternative than to resist of all the Cubans, but not the resistance of a synonym of supporting and bearing the difficulties. The plans of the Cubans have never been in that sense. The resistance of Cuban people is a resistance from the rebellious way, from the strength and vitality, the energy, all these forces together to take advantage, to overcome all the obstacles that the blockade is imposing on us. We will move forward with our own efforts, and from that point onwards, we will defeat the policy of the United States. President Diaz-Canel said that Cuba is made out of many homelands, and precisely what is more difficult for us is when they are trying to focus on us. And with this decorum, the people are marching today along the famous Malecon Seafront Drive in defense of our socialism, a march that for those who are actually tuning in at this moment on television, it was presided over by Raul Castro, leader of the Cuban Revolution, and also by the president of Cuba, Miguel Diaz-Canel Bermudez, and also members of the political bureau of the Communist Party, students, young people, students' organization of our country, and of course, with this mass of people of Havana and from different sectors, also at the beginning with the participation of representations of the health and public health, and also the scientific of the health ministry. This is the enemy that doesn't exist for the United States government, the Cuban people. And these Cuban people are marching now, defending their conquest, our pride of being Cuba. Drop the blockade. Let us show that we are able, what we Cubans are able to do with our own hands, with our own development, with our own way of doing things, with our own intelligence. Let us develop ourselves. Let us work ourselves. Let's live us in peace. The government of the United States has the possibility to have a common enemy within 90 people, 90 miles, which is the Cuban people. They are trying, picking it up against the Cuban people, against the government of Cuba. The ones that are marching today are the ones that are defending the Cuban government and the revolution. We are the ones that are defending our homeland. The armed forces are also defending our students of the universities, our military students, our professors, our professionals from different sectors that are represented here in this march of the people, which had been called just a few days ago by the President of the Republic, Comrade Diaz-Canel Bermudez, who was presiding this march together with the leader of the revolution, Comrade Raul Castro Ruz. Those eternal young rebels, like Talia was saying before, and who are here together with us. They gave us the homeland, they gave us the revolution, they gave us greatness, and they also gave us the firmness of being revolutionary and to build a new country according to our image and according to our liking. I think it's a moment and time to forget old differences and this obstination on the part of the United States government against Cuba. We are demonstrating once more, like I was saying before, this is a very needed march, and according to the moments that we're living in Cuba and that the whole world is living, of demonstrating the strength and the force and the unity of the people together with the party, together with the revolution, to the leaders. The young people are here, the workers, the peasants, the housewives are here, the people are here. This is the people of Cuba. They are very close to the leaders. They went to greet Diaz-Canel, to shake his hands. Our pioneers also are here. This is the truth people. This is the people that are not, does not give up. This is the people that are continue fighting despite of adversity, despite of the obstacles, who are defending the glory and the country that we're building. This is the example. You cannot see more solid example, and the Cuban television is actually broadcasting the reality of a country, the reality of a people in revolution. Yes, the blockade is a system of economic and coercive measures, unilateral measures, more comprehensive and longest that has been applied to any country in history. And the Cuban people is today against this policy. Long live the Cuban Revolution. Our national hero says that those who doesn't have the courage to fight, at least they should shut up. Long live the Cuban young people. Long live the Cuban Revolution. Down with the blockade. Long live the Communist Party of Cuba. We are on war footing and fighting and to overcome the blockade with our own efforts and with our intelligence and participation of everybody. Long live the heroic people of Cuba. Down with the blockade. We're not terrorists. Take us out of the list, please. Our President Diaz-Canel said we will get out of these difficulties with creativity, strengthening the programs of development with innovation, with work and the creative resistance. The moment is very complex, but it's not unsurmountable. Down with the blockade. Long live the heroic people of Cuba. Long fatherland of death, we will win. Cuban people are on war footing and struggling with the force of unity, with the force of truth and ideas. We're not terrorists.
Quítanos de la lista.
Take us out of the
Si
list.
deshecha en menudos pedazos, llega a ser mi bandera algún
If
día.
ever our flag is destroyed, our dead, raising their hands, will know how to defend it still. Long live the Cuban Revolution.
Abajo el bloqueo.
Down with the blockade.
Abajo el imperialismo.
Down with the imperialism.
Viva la patria.
Long live the homeland.
Abajo el bloqueo.
Down with the blockade.
Tumba el bloqueo. Ya. Túmbalo.
Stop with the blockade. We're not terrorists.
Quítanos de la lista.
Take us out of the list.
Los cubanos estamos de pie y combatiendo.
The Cubans are on war footing and struggling with the force of unity, with the force of truth and ideas.
Nuestro presidente.
Long live our president Mario Diaz-Canel Bermúdez.
Viva Fidel.
Long live Fidel and Raul.
Patria o muerte.
Fatherland or dead, we shall win.
Un 20 de diciembre glorioso.
A 20th of December, a glorious 20th of December, this march against blockade, the Cuban homeland is responding to the call of our president. Long live Fidel and Raul.
Viva la revolución cubana.
Long live the Cuban Revolution.
Tumba el bloqueo ya. Los cubanos estamos de pie y combatiendo con la fuerza de la unidad, con la fuerza de la verdad y las ideas. No somos terroristas. Quítanos de la lista. Abajo el bloqueo.
Down with the blockade.
Viva la juventud cubana.
Long live the Cuban youth.
Viva la revolución cubana.
Long live the Cuban Revolution.
Viva el Partido Comunista de Cuba.
Long live the Communist Party of Cuba.
Patria o muerte.
Fatherland or death,
Estamos de pie y combatiendo, dispuestos a saltar el bloqueo con nuestros propios esfuerzos.
we are ready to overcome the blockade with our own efforts, with our own intelligence, and all the participation of everybody.
Nuestro apóstol dijo, el que no tenga valor de sacrificarse, por lo menos...
Our national hero says that those who don't have the courage to sacrifice, at least let's shut up and let the other ones do it. Long live the Cuban Revolution.
Cubana. Abajo el bloqueo.
Down with the blockade.
Viva el Partido Comunista de Cuba.
Long live the Communist Party of Cuba.
Si deshecha en menudos pedazos, llega a ser mi bandera algún día, nuestros muertos, alzando los brazos, la sabrán defender todavía. ¡Viva la revolución cubana! ¡Abajo el bloqueo! ¡Abajo! ¡Viva el heroico pueblo de Cuba!
Long live the heroic people of Cuba.
Fidel y Raúl,
Long live Fidel and Raul.
patria o muerte.
Fatherland of dead, we shall overcome.
Bloqueo.
Down with the blockade.
No somos terroristas, quítanos de la lista.
We're not terrorists. Take us out of the list.
Yo soy Fidel. Yo soy Fidel.
We are Fidel. I am Fidel.
Viva la revolución cubana.
Long live the Cuban Revolution.
Viva Fidel y Raúl.
Long live Fidel and Raúl.
Abajo el bloqueo. Abajo. Viva el Partido Comunista de Cuba.
Long live the Cuba's Communist Party.
Patria o muerte.
Fatherland or death, we shall overcome.
Viva la revolución cubana. Viva. Viva la Unión de Jóvenes Comunistas. Viva.
Long live the Young Communist League.
Victoria siempre.
Ever onwards to victory. We continue this program on Cuban television of these images of this impressive march that is taking place along the Malecon Seafront Drive in the capital of Havana in representation of our country, a march for the unity against the U.S. blockade, which has been imposed by the United States government for more than 60 years, and also against the inclusion of Cuba in a list of countries that allegedly sponsor terrorism. This is the image of a country, a united country, a country that continues to fight to keep its independence and sovereignty. In the voices of young people, representatives of different organizations, student organizations, and also of sectors, diverse sectors of society. A march, a unified march, anti-imperialist march, with more energy and very much committed with the nation in the middle of complex situation in the economy. The people is marching to demonstrate that Cuba has a strong position against terrorism in all its form of manifestation, and that Cuba is actually a victim of terrorist activities which are funded and organized from the United States territory with the support, or at least with the oversight of the United States. With this march, and that they will continue fighting against the blockade, against the truth, against the lies, against Cuba, against the actions of the United States. It's a march of unity, a march of a people with Cuban flags, with 26th of July flags. Workplaces, schools are present here this afternoon, which has been marching for more than 1 hour and 20 minutes, which started at 4 o'clock, with the presence of the Army General, leader of the revolution, Raul Castro Ruz, and also of Miguel Canel Bermudez, president of our country, and also secretary of the Communist Party, in front of the people, at the forefront of the people, presiding over this march with these Cuban people, which we are part of, and we will defend at whatever price our dignity and our independence, as Fidel Castro taught us. Cuba was, is, and will be an eternal Baragua in front of the siege of the imperialism government of the United States against our country.
En la novena legislatura de la Asamblea Nacional del Poder Popular, con motivo de la proclamación de la Constitución de la República en el Palacio de Convenciones el 10 de abril.